The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
In that way, let me see if I can find it. I know there was one about the benefits of federalism.
Yeah, I think that was it.
One of the advantages of federalism over the years. This one?
Yep.
So basically, flexibility, it provides the states when it comes to experimenting with public policy. Right.
That's the one I kind of figured it out to be, but I didn't know why, like what specific examples I'm reading.
Okay. I know I just kind of said it in there. I don't recall. And there were some, like, for example, there was the minimum wage. Was that minimum wage chart in the reading?
Yeah, I think yeah.
Right. So the states are kind of all over the place in terms of what the minimum wage is in their state. I would have to pull up the where are we at? Files. Let's take a quick look at that chapter. Federalism's down here a ways. Nice. Okay. McCulloch versus Maryland. So here we're talking about national supremacy. If there's a federal law around some issue, that's the minimum standard for each state. So the minimum wage has to be, is it $7.50 at the national level, I think? I think the national minimum wage is $7.50. So states are free to go beyond that. They can't have a state minimum wage of $6.50, right? But in terms of experimenting, the federal government basically sets the standard. But states are also not limited to that, if that makes sense. Maybe this is in, I'm feeling like this is in the... You know what? There were two places that was. That would have been. Okay. Jack is doing me a real service here. Okay. I don't see it specifically in there. And that's one of my big things is okay, show me where this is in the text. I don't see it in there. That used to be almost word for word. That answer was in that chapter, and I don't know why it's not in there. That's not something that I would have removed with an edit intentionally, and it apparently I must have. So, okay. In the future, if you could keep that kind of thing to yourself, maybe talk to me about it in private afterwards so I don't get embarrassed in front of the whole class. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not. No, I'm joking, man. Totally. It's fine. Mistakes happen. Okay, yeah, wow. So, well, explaining then, I'm glad you were able to figure that out. That shows good thinking with the question. But I'll go through and I'll make whatever adjustment is fair then, because that's not, to ask you a question from the text that isn't there, that's not fair. Anyway. One of the things, and this would have also been in that section, I forget the Supreme Court justice's name, but they referred to states as like laboratories of democracy, right? Because almost all state governments and state constitutions look very much like the federal constitution and the federal government. You know, most states you have a Senate, you have a House, you have a governor who serves as an executive, you have a state court system, right? We are these like mini republics as part of one big republic. And so because a state government is able to appeal to local interests in a way that the federal government can't, right? Because you got 50 states competing, but here you've just kind of got one state in its interests, right? So it's much easier for Michigan to decide what to do, for example, about, I just was listening to this morning, you've heard about the invasion of Asian carp in the Great Lakes and the concerns that this poses for the ecological balance and so on, right? Michigan needs federal help to deal with that, but Michigan can do a lot, and also in partnership with other state governments, Michigan can do a lot to deal with this issue, okay? If they just left it to the federal government, or if the only people that could would be the federal government, it would be hard to get something because it has to go through this whole process of 50 other states agreeing. Does that make sense? So states have, you know, certain issues, states have histories, states have legacies, states have cultures, states have problems and challenges that others don't. If you're a state that's on an ocean, you have different challenges than a state like North Dakota or something that's landlocked where they don't, you know. So you have to have some kind of flexibility for states to do the things they need to do for themselves. And what happens, too, is that you get some really interesting things that come up. So you heard of Barack Obama? Mm-hmm. Have you heard of Mitt Romney? Mm-hmm. Who was Mitt Romney? The Republican opponent who ran against Barack Obama. What was his gig before that?
He was a senator?
No. He's a senator now from the state of Utah. He was governor of the state of Massachusetts. And while he was governor of the state of Massachusetts, he helped put into place this compromise legislation that was designed to get pretty much every person in Massachusetts, or the vast majority of the people in Massachusetts, some kind of health care coverage. Okay. The Massachusetts plan is one of the plans that Barack Obama and the Affordable Care Act was modeled after, you know, among others. But that was a case where, like, everybody in the country was like, check out what Massachusetts is doing. Okay, you know, they're doing it with some twine and some duct tape, but, like, they're doing it, and let's see how this works, right? It was really a tricky, difficult process. And while a lot of people saw flaws in what they did in Massachusetts, it was still something that a lot of people learned from, you know, and it set an example for other states. Does that help flesh that out at all? Okay. Okay. I have to send a text to myself. I think I'll remember this, but still. Where do you send reminders to yourself? If you need to remind yourself of something, what do you do?
On my calendar.
A calendar, you do it? You do text also? Yeah. Shopping list.
There's a reminders app.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have iPhone.
I don't have iPhone.
Oh.
Okay. Fix chapter 6. Federalism. And I'll say Jack because I'll remember that. Nice. Okay. Sweet. Any other questions on the quiz? or from the chapter? We're going to talk a little bit about the chapter now, but is there anything else that anyone wanted to go over or ask about?
I think so. If you can scroll down, I can't remember which one it is. I know I had a hard time with one of them. Go down. One that's like really long and complicated. I think. Hold on. It's this one, right? See if I can remember.
Rebellion.
Okay, I think it was that one.
Which one?
No, go up. Up more. A little more. That's it.
That's the one? Okay.
Yeah.
So in the text, we're talking about these concepts and practices, colonialism and imperialism. Okay? And you too?
Huh?
You're sick too?
No, I'm not.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just- I just started chewing gum, so.
That sounded like an accusation. You too?
I'm like, where? I'm trying
Sorry.
to learn this question.
All right, I apologize.
No, it's
That was rude. I didn't mean that.
Yeah.
Okay, so colonialism and imperialism. This is just like a quick history lesson, where I'm kind of like saying, all right, we've talked about what colonialism and imperialism are as concepts and talked about them in the chapter, and then here's a real world example,
Yeah,
and I'm
so
asking you to do this. So. What was the Joseph Conrad book? Is it Heart of Darkness? Did anyone have to read that for another class or in high school? No? Keep your eyes open for it. You may have to read it. It's up there with like Huckleberry Finn and these great like works of fiction. But he wrote this essentially about this experience of kind of like seeing what this looked like on the ground. Everybody talks about Hitler, and I don't mean to take anything away from what a piece of shit he was, but King Leopold in Belgium way outdoes Hitler. I mean, it's like remarkable. Really, yeah, just absolutely awful. Okay, does that help at all?
A little.
I mean, what were you asking then? What was
I
it?
just didn't understand it and I got it wrong.
Okay. It's a pretty big, I have some issues with this question personally, because not that it isn't clear, I feel like it's clear. And I think if you understand colonialism and imperialism, it makes sense what this is.
Okay.
But this is a pretty, I'm giving you a 150-word, explanation of something, and then asking you to define it, and this is a hard question. My quizzes generally, at least 10 of them are okay, I was awake when I read the chapter, I got this, And then there's always a couple that it's
harder.
man, why you gotta drag my, come on, But that's one of them, so. Okay. Anything else on the quiz before we move on? All right. Who can summarize, or hopefully any of us or all of us, can we summarize what was the system of government we were under before the Constitution? Do we remember what it was called? Articles of Confederation. Okay, so what was the problem with the Articles? Why did the framers think, what were some of the reasons they felt that we had to move away from that and towards something else?
Didn't give the states more power than the government?
The state governments, the individual state governments had way more power than the national government. In what way? How did that power dynamic show up? What could states do? What couldn't the federal government do? Anyone remember?
They were concerned about the military.
Okay.
It wasn't, they wouldn't, the national security, correct?
Yeah. I mean, we do a lot of romanticizing in American history about the militias during the Revolutionary War. Like, oh, we were just a bunch of ragtag civilians who picked up a gun and defended the hood, you know? Like, that's kind of how it's... And, you know, I mean, militias were effective, but there's a lot more to it. And the concern was, like, okay, we can't rely on militias anymore. And they're also looking sort of internally at the continent. You know, because for all of them, they have this vision that, like, you know, the material, the economic resources of this land are incredible, right? And, like, we need a strong military to not only deal with foreign powers like Britain, but also the Indian nations, right? So, yeah, there's this concern of, like, we can't just have regional, like, ad hoc kind of military. So that's one. What else? What else? What could states do? What was the federal government limited in?
I want to say, like, controlling people's property. Like,
How so?
controlling. Yeah, I don't want to guess.
Just guessing. I mean, property has something to do with it, you know.
Or was it like back in the day, like back in like when the Articles of Confederation was out? Was it you think that business had to pay state taxes, or
Mm-hmm.
we had to pay state taxes?
Whoops. I mean, from an economic perspective, there were all kinds of just jacked up things. Under the British, local economies were local and they stayed local. Any kind of national economy or any kind of international economy, that was all controlled by the British. And any businesses or entrepreneurs in the United States who wanted to try to challenge that in some way were not able to do it, right? They were limited in how they could grow and develop and expand. You know, the example I give in the text, if you make something and you want to sell it in another state, you've got to deal with the fact that these states have different currencies, right? Like here, we just assume, like, I got $10 in my wallet, it's worth $10 in California, just like it is in Michigan. That wasn't the case. You didn't have a standard for weights and measures, so how much was a foot or how much was a pound? All of these factors made it really different. And you had different laws governing the sale of different things. State laws were written to benefit their own internal state economies and state businesses as much as possible. And that's fine, but it also means that the economy can't grow on a national scale, right? And the framers, a lot of them were very interested in how do we develop as a national economy? How do we become a national power to rival that of somebody like France or Spain or England, right? So that was a big part of it. So one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation, you know, coming off of what Nicole said, like giving states too much power, and that included too much power to basically keep economies local, and not be able to grow. So that was a big problem. Going back to what Jack said in the military, you also have there's a lot of internal, like, class conflict going on. Shays' Rebellion is a big factor. Do you remember what Shays' Rebellion was?
Yeah, when I think it was a man that came for the war and he fought against the government or something.
Daniel Shays, this guy in Massachusetts, you know, returns from the war like a lot of veterans. Nothing's been going on with their farm or their property while they've been gone. and the state government is then like, oh yeah, you're late on taxes, and we are also jacking up your taxes because now we have to pay for the war that we just won. And the people who helped fund that war, they want their money back, right? So we're raising taxes on you. Welcome home and thank you for your service. And that was happening across the country, really, but Massachusetts in particular was a tough spot, and so they just rebelled, you know. And in part, there was like this principle. I wrote about it in the textbook that for a lot of veterans coming back from that war, their perspective was, I don't know, and I think it had a lot of credence. Their perspective was, look, we fought to free this land from British oppression. We freed the land from British oppression. Now the land is ours. And anyone who tries to take it from us is an enemy to liberty. And like they were like, hey, we did this. Like, this is ours now. This isn't now yours to suddenly take from us. Like, what the? We didn't fight in the war so that we could come home and be evicted. You know what I mean? Or taxed out of existence. So, yeah, people were pissed. People were really pissed. And so they got guns and they like stopped, a courthouse from opening so that they couldn't deliver eviction notices or things like that or seize people's farms. And so it was this whole thing that was going and going. And eventually the rebellion's finally put down. But then you have all of this political agitation and organizing and so on, and they succeed in changing enough state government policies where farmers actually get some debt relief, right? And that was one of the things that concerned the framers, because the framers were like, okay, property is property, you have a contract, you got to pay what you owe, like, that's the law, and if we can get an armed mob to basically either threaten or then like vote and change that, like that's not acceptable, right? Property rights have to be protected, and if somebody has provided a certain amount of money and that money is owed, that money's got to be paid, right? And so that was one of their concerns too. They didn't see enough protections for property and contracts in the Articles of Confederation.
So, okay, because for chapter 6, I had a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
On the reading down, for number 9, it says, what is a fraction? Why was Madison, amongst others, considered about fractions?
I think it's factions.
Factions.
Yeah.
I said fractions.
Yeah, no, it's all right. I mean, in a way, it's kind of a similar concept, but yeah, so a faction. So Madison's concerned about factions because really looking at something like Shays' Rebellion and looking like the other sort of rebellions and riots and things that are happening around the country at that time and saying, if we don't do something to get a handle on this, one of these regional rebellions could potentially... it could spread. It could spread in a way that we're not prepared for and that we're not able to defeat or put down. Like in Massachusetts, we were at least able to put down Shays' Rebellion, right? So we have to be able to deal with that and do something about that. And so that's the faction that they're concerned about. When we talk about factions today, we're often talking about political parties or interest groups. And since there are some interest groups that wield a whole lot of influence over government, we can kind of look at them as a faction. The idea of a faction is like you're a smaller group of people that doesn't represent the interests of the whole, but you're able to say what happens, you know? And so but really what Madison and others were concerned about was popular revolt, you know, people getting guns and rebelling, basically. Saying, we fought for the land is ours, come and try to take it from us. You know? What was another question you had from the chapter? Did that answer your question, Diamond?
Yeah. It's for number 10. It says, what does James Madison mean when he stated that the founders need to discover a Republican remedy for those disease, most instance most incidents to Republican?
Yeah, that's a tricky quote. So we need Republican remedies. What's a remedy for those of us who aren't feeling well?
So they
Cough medicine.
Okay. So a cure, some kind of help, some kind of, a remedy is something that cures it or fixes it. Yes, we need cough medicine or bone broth or whatever. That would have been a good question. What was the bone broth to the national cold that met us? That would be a terrible question. Yeah. Anyway, so we need Republican remedies. By Republican, he's referring to that form of democratic governance where we elect representatives to do this work of governing for us, right? Mm-hmm. So we need Republican remedies. We need solutions that are in that system to the, what is the next part of it? To the dangers, most incident, or the problems? I don't remember.
Most incident to Republican government.
Okay. So basically what he's saying is like one of the problems with democratic governance and Republican systems is that there's going to be a potential for the people to decide wrong. How do we minimize that threat, right? A lot of people interpret this as, and I think it's right, as this indication that Madison is not that psyched on democracy, right? None of the framers are really that excited about democracy. They look at it as generally a threat, something that's too hard to contain. They don't want it. It's part of how they associate the Articles of Confederation with the states having too much power and people in those states having too much power. But they're also looking at it from the perspective of, quick, radical, significant change is not great. We don't want like a king, in the same way that a king can come through and just say, doing it this way now. And you're like, okay, I hope your mood doesn't change next week because the king has the power to determine, right? And so we need a system that guards against that. We don't want quick, radical change. What we want is a system where we're considering what's going on, we're looking at the long-term impacts on the nation, we're considering the growth and the strength of the nation. We're not looking at just, I want this now, and having to give it to them, right? So that's one of the reasons Madison and others are concerned about democracy, right? This tendency toward quick, radical change, and they're trying to avoid that. Like a lot of elites, too, they don't really have a lot of faith in the people. They don't really like the common people and don't really trust them very much. They're differing in this, and for different reasons, right? Some of them are more sympathetic than others, but that sounds harsh, right? It's sort of like, some upper crust, college professors like, oh yes, democracy is the way to go, and then they meet some homeless person who's, got problems, and you're like, well, except for you. If you could sit it out, that'd be great. Or is their neighbor that they don't agree with, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, for a lot of us, unfortunately, we look at democracy sometimes and we're like, you know what, I wouldn't mind if all these people didn't vote. Which is a terrible, that's not the way you're supposed to go with it, right? But we see this up until the present time. We're in the middle of an election, right? And that election's going to just grow and get more. Yeah, no idea what's coming. We have no idea what's coming this year, man. This presidential election is going to be some shit. No, I'm serious. There's, the way the parties are, the kind of conversations the parties are having about how you get voter turnout. But what they're also talking about is how do you decrease voter turnout, right?
Why do they want that?
Because if you can, okay.
None is better than no, right?
What do you mean?
No vote is better than voting no.
Sure, yeah. Well, but the thing is, it's who is doing that, right?
Okay.
Do you guys remember this race in Alabama that just happened a couple years ago? This guy, Roy Moore. He's a former judge. Roy Moore was the Republican nominee for Senate. He was running against a Democrat. I forget, Doug Jones was the Democrat's name. And because it was Alabama, Doug Jones was basically a moderate Republican. Like, as a Democrat, he's pretty, like, center-right. And Roy Moore was considered a pretty, I guess you could say, radical conservative candidate. Anyway, this stuff came up with Roy Moore. Do you remember what happened?
No, tell us.
So, all these allegations around Roy Moore and young women, right? Like, he'd be hanging around malls, signing, like, 14 and 16-year-old girls' yearbooks, like, but just, like, all this, like, these interactions and then accusations of him, like molesting, or I mean, it was pretty nasty. The stuff that was coming out, it was like, wow, okay. And all these people coming forward and saying this, and you guys remember this about Joe Biden? Mm-hmm. Everyone was like, why do you got to put your hands on every woman's shoulders that you meet? Or like, tell them they're hot or something. It's like, dude, Biden's kind of creepy. Well, Moore was like super creepy, apparently. Anyway, looked like Moore still just might win. It was still a tight race. A lot of people in Alabama were like, you know what? Moore's our guy. However, there was a guy, he wasn't, I don't know if he was a Democratic Party activist. I know he was sympathetic to the Democratic Party. But he looked at the 2016 election, and he was like, misinformation and dividing voters, that was one of the ways that Trump won, right? Because they were able to divide, and, the Democratic Party turnout, even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, they felt like there could have been a lot more party unity behind Hillary Clinton than there was. And so in Alabama, this guy worked with these other folks to start this campaign saying that Roy Moore was in favor of prohibition. You guys know what prohibition is? You don't get to buy alcohol, right? And that there was this kind of like fringe movement in Alabama that supported going back, like changing the state constitution to making it a dry state, and to have prohibition, and that Roy Moore was essentially on board with this. There wasn't really any evidence that Moore was on board with this, right? Or that Moore would even do this. But they were able to put out enough misinformation and disinformation, in some cases straight up lies, that there were enough moderate Republicans who were cool. They were cool with Moore being a molester, apparently. But like this notion of prohibition, they were like, okay, this is too much. Come on. Like, I don't know if this other stuff about you is true, but this is not, And they were able to keep enough kind of like moderate-leaning Republicans to stay home. I don't know to what effect this had, but it was cited as being like one of the factors that led to Roy's defeat. Okay. That's like that whole model for running an election is what we're going to be dealing with. So as citizens, this is going to be really hard because we're going to get so much misinformation, so much disinformation. As we see these messages, if we want to find out if they're true, it's going to take work and time, and a lot of us don't want to do that. And so the hope is, from a lot of people, that the effect of this is just going to keep folks home, especially in certain states or in certain communities. Like, okay, we need to just keep people home, and then we'll do better if they stay home. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's a pretty, it's going to be something. I'm trying not to be judgmental about it, but I don't know. I don't really like disinformation. I don't like people saying things that aren't true. I don't care what side you're on. Like, candidates that I support and like give money to, like when they say stuff that's not true, I'm like, fix that. Don't do that. But
That's all ultimately how you have to get it down to two candidates. Is you have to divide and conquer, right? You got to divide people, and that's how you narrow.
Or
it
also
down. You
bring
got all these people on one side, and then all these other people on that side. There's your two candidates that represent your side.
Yeah, I mean it is, but it's also, I mean, you hope the ideal, right? The democratic ideal is that you've gotten there because you've had a rigorous but also fair examination of like who these people are and what they're going to do. You know what I mean? Like that's what you hope, not because, you know, Marco Rubio said that Donald Trump maybe has a small genitalia. Did you know this? Were you following this? Marco Rubio made some comment about Trump. He totally baited him, right? But just that because Trump has small hands, that must mean that something else is small. And of course, what did Trump do? He gets up on stage like, "Believe me, there's no problem. Believe me." It's just like, I don't want to even hear this. You guys are like 10 years old, like both of you, you know. Like Rubio was an idiot, you know, like whether Trump took the bait or not, that was like an awful thing to say. And then Trump suggesting that Ted Cruz's father was involved in the Kennedy assassination. Like all of this stuff is just like, come on, you know, and then, you know, and however that happens with the Democrats, like it's, the tendency is like to go there, you know, and I would like to see that tendency brought back, you know, and it's, or retreat a little bit from that. But it's, yeah, I mean, the division is, I guess, there, but what you hope with the process is like, okay, we went through this, folks wanted Mike Bloomberg, or folks wanted Pete Buttigieg, or folks wanted Bernie Sanders. Okay, let's now have the debate of ideas with Donald Trump, and let's get through that, right? I mean, that's how you hope it goes, you know. That's not how it goes. It's not how it's going. But, yeah. Okay, anyway, I want to look quickly at something based on this discussion we've just had about the Constitution or the, come on, about the Articles of Confederation and some of the concerns and the shortcomings around this by the framers. When you go through the Constitution, if you read the Constitution and you have this understanding of what the framers were concerned about, you see all these points here. A lot of these, without the context, it doesn't really make any sense. You know what I mean? Like, why are they saying this? But for each of these things here, there's some historical context, what was happening at the time that we can point to. Okay. So this is Article 1, Section 8. Article 1 deals with the legislative branch, the Congress. And this is the longest, if you like stood back and like looked at the Constitution, Article 1 is the most substantive. There's the most there. And like this is the branch of government that I think they had the most, they thought would have the most power. This is where most of the work of governing was going to be done. And so the powers of Congress, what Congress can do, what Congress can't do, how it's structured, you see like the most thought, I think, here. So Section 8 starts with, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect duties, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Well, no, let's read this whole thing. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. This is all basically like getting money. To pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Have we ever had any debt? Never. We had it then. This is the thing, like in terms of like debt, this is not necessarily a new thing. Like right away, we're starting in debt. You know, and they're saying like, hey, we got debts to pay. And provide for the common defense and general welfare of the U.S. That's a reflection of the preamble to the Constitution. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Okay? So if you've got, for example, an import tax on some good from Britain, New York and North Carolina both have to pay the same thing, right? You can't favor one state or another. So they're going to be uniform throughout the U.S. And then it goes on. Oh, by the way, the Congress shall have power. Shall is a really important legal term. If you're looking at a contract and the contract says shall do something, like you as a signer of the contract, you shall do something, that means you got to do it, right? You are required to do that as a term of this contract. If it says you may do this, may legally means I can do it or I can go have a sandwich, right? I don't have to do it if I don't want to.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is using very strong language to say, like, Congress has this power. Okay? Congress has this power. And so these, going back to the quiz, these are the enumerated powers of Congress. This is where the framers said, all right, here are these specific, clear powers that Congress has. Excuse me. To borrow money, regulate commerce with foreign nations, to coin money, to regulate the value thereof and a foreign coin and fix the standard of weights and measures. Right there in just one, you're solving one of these big problems with the Articles of Confederation, right? Now we're going to have a national currency. You know, a pound is going to be a pound no matter where you're at. A foot or 12 inches or whatever it is, an inch is going to be an inch anywhere. To punish counterfeiting, to establish post offices and post roads. In the early part of U.S. history, the post office was really the government for everybody, for most people. Unless you happen to live near a military base, like the face of the government in most communities throughout the country was the post office. Okay. To promote the progress of science and useful arts, securing for limited times to authors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, so we have patents and copyrights, to set up a court system, piracies and felonies, to declare war, to raise and support armies, blah, 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 right? I mean, it goes on. You've got militia training. And so on. And then, down here, to make all law, this is, all of this is a continuation, right? Again, you want to read the contract carefully. You see after every sentence, right? This is one big sentence. All of these, 1 through 18, is one long run-on sentence. So the Congress shall have power. You want to take this phrase and basically put it in front of all of these, right? The Congress shall have power to, right? Because you've got that winking emoticon thing right there. Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, what you need to do and what is proper to do, for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Meaning, Congress also has all the power that they need in order to do this, right? Not only do they have the power to do this, but any additional powers that they need to do this, they have. So they call this the necessary and proper clause. It's also called the elastic clause. Because over time, Congress is like, oh, okay, well, we're passing this law. And somebody says, but that's not in the list of things that you can do. And Congress says, yeah, right, but it also says over here in number 3 that we have, we're able to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. So this is part of our role with that. In order for us to regulate commerce, we have to pass this law.
So really, right? Congress is really the, how can I say it this way? So really the Constitution is in the favor of the Congress. Because basically, like, hey, this is what we said, and we have the Constitution to back us up.
Essentially, depending on how strong the Congress is, right? Yes. But the Congress is only as strong as it is relative to the power of the president and relative to the power of the courts. Okay? And this is where not only separation of powers, but checks and balances come into play. Okay. Because a lot of this makes people nervous, right? Like, whoa, you're giving all these people this power, right? But Congress, whatever Congress does, has to be approved by the president, right? And if the president, so they send a bill to the president says, no, you know what, I'm not signing this, I don't agree. Take 2000 something, I don't know, when George W. Bush was president. Congress passed a bill allowing for federal funding for stem cell research. President Bush vetoed it. It went back to the Congress, and both the House and the Senate passed the bill again, this time with a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate. So 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate voted in favor of this bill. And that meant that the bill was now law. The president didn't have to sign it because a supermajority of the Senate and the House were in favor of it. So that's one example of this checks and balances, right? Or not checks. The president vetoing is a check on congressional power, right? It's a way to sort of balance power.
That ties into checks and balances.
That ties into checks and balances. But then also, even if it becomes a law, that law can be challenged in the court system, right? And who knows who's sitting on that court or where their loyalties lie, right? One of the things we're going to learn about the court system is the ideological breakdown of the court and what the court looks like. A lot of folks, for example, are very excited about what it would mean to have President Elizabeth Warren or President Bernie Sanders. People who are pushing for much more bold, radical change than we've seen in this country in a few decades. Whatever they do is going to be challenged in courts where, in most cases, you have a majority of people who don't share their ideological position, right? They're more center-right, sometimes far-right, okay, on the courts, on the U.S. Federal courts. So, that's another example of separation of powers and checks and balances, right? So Congress makes the law, the president administers the law and enforces them and makes sure that they're followed. But then those laws can also be challenged in court, okay? And those laws can then be reduced, or they can be strengthened, or they can be eliminated, right?
So what do you mean by laws can be strengthened or eliminated? And then you said something.
Strength, I guess I mean limited, right? So Congress might pass a law. Let me think of a good example. Take something like Obama's healthcare law, the Affordable Care Act, right? That was challenged in court again and again and again. And one of the things that was challenged was there was a tax, basically, that folks argued was unconstitutional. That made its way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court found that the tax was constitutional. But there have been other cases where parts of Obamacare had been scaled back. The courts have found that Congress didn't have the authority to do what it did in making that law. So there was the Affordable Care Act when it passed, and now there's the Affordable Care Act after it's made its way through the court system, right? So what it had done originally, it's now limited in its scope of what it's able to do. Right. Does that make sense? So yeah, that's that. Or you could also have a law that gets challenged in the courts, and the courts are like, nope, law's fine. We don't see a constitutional issue here. We're good. And so, you know what I'm saying? So now the law can go forward as it was intended by Congress. Any other questions?
I had a question on the study guide. For I got number 25 and number 7. Okay, so for number 7, it says, what were some of the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation from the perspectives of the farmers of the Constitution?
Right. So we talked about that we had a weak military. States had too much power. The federal government didn't have enough power. The federal government, if they wanted to tax the states to raise money for something, they had no enforcement mechanism. They had no way to get that money. You had all of the economic and monetary issues that we discussed around currency, weights and measures. The state of Virginia could make a deal with imports from Britain that benefited Virginia but didn't favor New York or North Carolina. You know what I mean? So all of those would fall into that. You said you had another one?
Number 25. It says, how did the creation of the Senate help strengthen slavery and white supremacy? What about the electoral college?
Okay, so that was that whole section on race in the Constitution. Can I hold off on that, if you don't mind? I want to get back to this quickly and finish up where we were going here.
Okay.
Do you remember the court case where the idea that Congress has powers that are necessary and proper? What was that court case where this was challenged? What did Congress try to do?
I think it was with the regulated money.
Okay.
And so they interpreted that as, well, we need to build a bank or something.
Right. Well, the idea was since we have a federal currency, we can have a national bank. Right. The idea is if you have the power to coin money, then you should have the power to build a building to put it in. Right. And so they decided to put that bank in Maryland. Well, Maryland said, "Oh, nice bank. We're going to tax it." And the federal government's like, "You can't tax us. We're the federal government. Like, this isn't, And Maryland said, "You're doing something in our state. Yes, we can tax you." And so this fight kind of goes to the Supreme Court. And one of the arguments by Maryland doesn't say anything in here about having the power to build a bank. So you can't do this. And basically, because we're a state, we have the power to tax, right? We're not limited in our ability to do this. So the court finds two things. This is the case McCulloch versus Maryland, right? So the court finds no, if you have the power to coin money, it is a necessary and proper power to also build a bank to put it in, right? It makes perfect sense, even though it doesn't say you have the power to build a bank. That's a power that's necessary and proper for your ability to coin money. Follow? It's a nice, easy example, right? But the court also finds, where are we at? In Article 6. Number 2, this Constitution and the laws of the U.S., which shall be made in pursuance thereof, which is another way of saying this Constitution and the laws that Congress passes based on it. All treaties, blah, 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 shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, regardless of what the Constitution or the laws of that state say. Okay? The state of Maryland could have had a constitutional amendment that said we have the power to tax the federal government, right? It doesn't matter.
according to this, that law that Congress passed establishing the building of a national bank, that's now the law of the land. That's the supreme law of the land. And states have to abide by it. Okay?
So this.
Yes.
So Article. I'm not good with Roman numerals. Never mind.
That's
So
okay.
Article 6, number
6.
2 is basically just talking about like.
That's national supremacy.
Okay.
That's where
So if
we
I
get
get-
that's where we get this idea that says, look, federal law is federal law. Okay, this was passed by representatives from people across from states across this country, and this is national policy, and states have to abide by it. Right. Again, like we said, states can go beyond it if they want, but you have to abide by federal law. We're seeing why. One of the reasons I call this, the fact that we have the Constitution is kind of like a counter-revolution, right? This idea, like, if you're just standing back and kind of looking and saying, yeah, these are the things you want to do, this is how you want to develop as a nation, yeah, you need a stronger federal government. But in the context and in the history and what the Europeans and the United States had just been struggling against, right? British imperialism and oppression. This scares people. This is like kind of authoritarian. This is saying, hey, what we say goes, and you can point and say, well, look, we've got this kind of democratic system in place. These are elected representatives. The states vote for the senators. You've got the president over here. They're working together. You've got this court system. There's all these protections in place so that we don't have authoritarianism. But this strikes people as a little authoritarian, and it strikes Maryland as authoritarian. But the court's like, no, you can, this Article 6 says this. This is the law Congress passed, and that's it. You gotta abide by it.
So basically, the rest of the Constitution is really a 50-50, but Article 6 is something that is the hammer and like that's something that we have to respect.
It's not 50-50, right?
Right.
Like if you go back, Section 9. I would say it's 50-50, but I would make the split 50 like specific and 50 who knows.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a lot that's left. Like when you go to the section on the presidency, like when I think of the federal government today, I think of Trump or I think of Obama. Like I think of the president, this single person, and that's not how we're supposed to think of it, right? But we think of this sort of single person. And when you look at Article 2, it's like there's nothing there. Not nothing there. There's something there. But it's like compared to Congress, they were like, oh, and we're going to have a president. And let's see how that works out, right? I'm totally simplifying it or being too simplistic, but that's kind of how it seems. But going to Section 10, no state shall enter. It doesn't start with the state shall have the power. It's like Congress has the power to do this. States, you can't do this. Like this is this list on this list of like what states can't do, basically. Right? So they can't enter into treaties, alliances, or confederations. They can't grant titles of nobility, and so on, right? All of these things that states could do, particularly around economic and monetary issues, are, restricted here. These are also limitations on the power of Congress above them in Section 9. Any of this helping the text kind of be fleshed out a little bit, a little more clear? Diamond, you had the question about race in the Constitution. Was there a specific thing about that, or that you didn't understand in that section, or?
Like I didn't understand. Like, what do they mean by the creation, and what about the electoral college? Like, what do they mean?
Well, because the race and slavery are shaping the Constitution and how. Different institutions and structures of the Constitution, right? So, if you're a member of Congress, you are there as a representative of a district. And if you're Wyoming, that district is the entire state. If you're in Michigan, you're one of 13 districts, right? So, each district represents a certain number of people. Well, in 1792 or whatever, who's the people, right? If you're in Virginia or North Carolina or Mississippi, anywhere from a third to a half of the people are actually enslaved persons. Excuse me. So if you're Virginia and the number of representatives you have in the House depends on population, who are you counting in the population? Who's people, right? Virginia's like, well, of course our enslaved persons are people. You're like, oh, really? Do they have the rights that people have? No, of course not, right? We just want them to count toward representation. And if they don't count toward representation, we're out of here. Okay? So you have this system that depends on the dehumanization of people in order for it to function, right? The slave labor system.
So when they say
sorry.
I don't mean
No, it's okay. It's okay.
help strengthen slavery. So what they mean by like strengthen it to make people stay in slavery at that time, or to like
what the constitutional protections for property, the constitutional assurances that the importation of slaves would not end for another, is it 10 or 15 years from when they signed it? Not until 1808. So the importation of slaves is banned at that point. So you have that, you have the protections of property, and since enslaved persons are considered property, that helps strengthen that system. And then you also have, and this is where it's really important, this issue of representation. So the 3/5 compromise, what is this?
Slave counts.
What's that?
Slave counts.
Okay, for every 5 enslaved persons, 3 of them are going to count toward representation in that state. And this artificially boosts the representation in the House of Representatives of different states. So Virginia I don't remember the numbers exactly, so Virginia might have only had 16 representatives in the House. Well, now they've got 22, right? Because of the 3/5 compromise. Does that make sense? So not only do they now have more power and more representation in the House of Representatives, but how do we elect the president? It's not by popular vote. If it were by popular vote, states like Virginia and South Carolina and Mississippi, and even some northern states where you have less significant numbers of enslaved persons, they don't have as much impact in electing the president. So an electoral college based on their number of representatives instead of the population means that they would have more of an impact in electing the president.
That's only for the electoral college, though.
That's for the, but that's everything, right? Because, not everything, but look, so just to take Virginia, and I don't remember, let me just do these numbers. So let's say 20 seats without the 3/5 compromise. Maybe now they have 29 seats, probably more, with the 3/5 compromise. Now they have more power in the House of Representatives, the creation of the Senate, where each state has 2 representatives regardless of population, helps give states, particularly with high numbers of enslaved persons in them, additional power, okay? And they're representing state interests, and those senators are elected by state legislatures. Well, for the first, how long? I mean, like 1792 to the Civil War, I mean, we're almost looking at 100 years where the Senate, and the Senate is also in charge of working with the president around nominating and approving judges and justices to the courts. Like slave labor interests are dominating the Senate, and they're dominating the House of Representatives for the first 100 years, right? On top of that, the Electoral College, since you're not counting the popular vote, you're counting like, okay, you have Virginia has 29 seats plus 2 senators. That means they have 31 electoral votes that go toward the president, right? Instead of having 22, they have 31. That gives them more power in determining who's going to be president, right? So that's how race and slavery are shaping this. Okay, do we have time to do this? We don't, man. Okay. That's all right, though. Those are good questions. Let's do this for a quick second. Just going to tease you here. This is a professor named Michael Seidman, not sure how you pronounce his name. And this is a TEDx talk. Everyone loves these things. At Georgetown University, and it's called "Let's Throw Away the Constitution." So a nice provocative title.
I have an idea, and the idea is that all of us ought to give up on the notion that we have to obey the Constitution of the United States. Now, there is there's one problem with this idea, and that is that nobody agrees with it. Liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, blue state and red state, Obama and Ted Cruz, the Boston Red Sox and the Cardinals, they all agree that this idea is not only wrong, it's stupid, it's dumb, it's dangerous, and it's evil. So I'm really quite proud that in this age of partisan meltdown, I've been able to bring the country together like this. But to say the least, this is kind of a heavy lift, convincing people that this is the right thing to do. So at the very least, I hope you guys give me a degree of difficulty points for this. But you know what? If you think about it for a minute, the people who really bear the burden of proof are the people who think we ought to obey the Constitution. So what we're talking about is the oldest Constitution in the world. It's also the most difficult to amend. It was written at a time when the United States was a tiny rural republic, huddled along the eastern seaboard, largely supported by slave labor. The people who wrote it knew nothing about industrialization or the internet or the war on terror or the National Football League. They'd never heard of Bill Gates or Albert Einstein or Adolf Hitler or Lady Gaga. These
Lady
were
Gaga.
people who knew nothing of our present country. So why on earth ought we to treat their beliefs, their hopes, their ideas, their obsessions as our own? It just seems really nuts. Here's another way to put it. Let's suppose for the moment that you were the President of the United States or a Supreme Court Justice. I know at least one person in the audience is going to be a Supreme Court Justice. Or a member of Congress, or just a really concerned citizen. And you had a really important issue of public policy that you had to decide. And you're a careful, responsible person, so you're going to spend some time studying this, right? And you'll talk to people who are experts. Maybe you'll talk to social scientists and figure out exactly what the effectiveness is going to be. Maybe you would talk to philosophers or theologians and think about what the morality and ethics of it is. And eventually, after really careful thought and a lot of consultation, you decide. And let's just suppose you decide to do X. Then, right at the moment you're about to do X, somebody comes running into the room and they say, wait a second, don't do it yet. I've got something really important to tell you. What's that? Well, people who died over 200 years ago, and who, by the way, thought it was perfectly fine to own other human beings, and thought that women had no role to play in public affairs, and thought that the only people who should be allowed to vote are white male property owners, those people think the right thing to do is not X. And then, just because those people think not X is the right thing to do, you say, oh, sorry, I'm going to change my mind. Let's do not X. Pardon me, but you'd have to have your head examined if that's what you did. Now,
all right.
All of this has been very
provocative. A little bit. As you will see, how long is this? This is about 16 minutes long. It's a good setup. His point actually becomes a little more nuanced, a little more contextualized, but it's an interesting one. Sometimes I'm like, yeah. Sometimes I'm like, nah. But I like it because it's provocative. And so I'm going to post this in our. Also going to put this in our week 6 folder. How do you do this? Share link. Anybody here watch TED Talks ever? Sometimes. They can be fun. I also like the videos that come out where they mock TED Talks. I think those are really funny too. Actually, I think this might have been already there, but that's okay. Let's give up on nice type. Okay. Okay, so that's there too. And published. So watch that also. That's a good. That's also a good thing to if you want to use for your lessons learned. Okay. Why don't we throat starting to close up a little bit? Does anyone have any other questions or anything you want to ask about? Next week is the legal system and the courts. So we've sort of moved away now. We started with these kind of like really big, broad, general themes, ideas, principles, concepts in American politics, government, and so on. Started to get a little more specific, looking at the Constitution, providing the framework for the system of government that we have, and now we're going to start looking at the specific institutions of the federal government, starting with the courts and then Congress and the presidency. Okay? So the courts is the first one.
And that's next week's chapter.
Good luck with today's lesson.